Imagine being beheaded for your faith and still preaching the gospel while holding your own severed head. This is not fiction. This is the story of St. Denis of Paris. In the year 250 AD, when Paris was but a humble Roman outpost known as Lutetia, a fiery young bishop named Denis arrived, flanked by two devoted companions, Rusticus, the learned priest, and Eleutherius, the steadfast deacon. They came not of their own accord, but were sent forth from Rome, most likely commissioned by the venerable Bishop Fabian, shepherd of the church in those perilous days, to carry the torch of the gospel into the very heart of a city thick with idolatry, where altars smoked with incense rising to strange and nameless gods. Saint Gregory of Tours, writing in his 6th century Historia Francorum, recounts that Denis, an impassioned Italian missionary, was one of 7 bishops dispatched across Gaul, today's France, during the reign of Emperor Decius, a ruler infamous for his savage persecutions of Christians. With the unquenchable fervor of his divine calling, Denis lifted his voice in the public squares and bustling marketplaces, proclaiming Christ boldly to all who would listen. On an island amid the Seine, he laid the foundations of a church that would become the seed of faith for generations. His eloquence, mingled with the sincerity of his spirit, drew hearts in droves, the young and the aged, the curious and the weary, gathering them under the banner of the cross. From these beginnings, Denis is remembered as the founder of the first Christian community in Paris. And as the faith blossomed, he was consecrated as the city's very first bishop, faithfully assisted by Rusticus, the erudite priest whose wisdom strengthened the flock, and Eleutherius, the diligent deacon whose devotions steadied the work. The Romans bowed before a vast pantheon of gods: Jupiter, king of thunder; Mars, lord of war; Venus, radiant goddess of love. And when they subdued the Gauls, they did not discard their deities, but fused them together, weaving Roman and Celtic gods into a single tapestry of power and superstition. Yet at the center of all this stood the imperial cult itself, the emperor exalted as divine, the very embodiment of Rome's authority and might. To worship was not merely piety, it was allegiance. Religion was Rome, and Rome was religion. Every citizen was expected to take part in sacrifice, pouring out wine, scattering incense, slaughtering beasts, ritual acts meant to appease the capricious gods and secure the empire's strength. Those who refused were seen not only as impious, but as traitors, enemies of Rome itself. It was under this iron weight of expectation that persecution reached the streets of Paris. The flames of hostility were fanned by Emperor Decius, AD 249 to 251, remembered as one of the most relentless persecutors of the early church. Unlike earlier sporadic crackdowns, his campaign was deliberate, systematic, and merciless. He issued an edict that shook the empire to its core. Every man, woman, and child was required to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods and obtain a certificate of compliance, a libellus, as proof of loyalty to the state. To resist was to court death. Torture chambers filled, prisons overflowed, and execution grounds ran red with the blood of the faithful. The storm broke violently across the empire. Pope Fabian, Bishop of Rome, was among the first to fall, a shepherd struck down in the heart of Christendom. From Carthage in the south to Antioch in the east, Christians were hunted, dragged before tribunals, and forced to choose between Caesar and Christ. In Rome itself, men like St. Stephen and many bishops were martyred, their faith unshaken even as their bodies were broken. And the fury did not end with Decius. His successors, Valerian and later the dreaded Diocletian, carried on the torch of bloodshed, intensifying the empire's war against the church. Yet Rome's violence achieved the very opposite of what it intended. The persecutions, designed to strangle the church at its birth, only magnified its power. For every believer who fell, 2 more arose, inspired by their courage. The unyielding cry of the martyrs proclaimed a higher allegiance that no sword could silence. Jesus is Lord, not Caesar. The empire's rage merely revealed the truth. that the gospel stood as a rival claim to Rome's supremacy, a kingdom not of this world, yet greater than all the empires of men. And so, as Tertullian had declared decades earlier, the paradox of faith proved unshakable. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Denis preached without fear, his voice ringing through marketplaces and homes, calling the people of Lutetia to cast away their idols and turn to the living Christ. With each passing day, conversions multiplied, hearts awakened, and the fragile hold of paganism began to tremble. Yet with this growth came fury. The pagan priests, jealous of their vanishing influence, seethed with rage, their whispers fanning into accusations before the authorities. One fateful morning, the fragile peace was shattered. Roman soldiers stormed into a gathering of believers, their swords clanging against shields, their voices barking orders. Denis, Rusticus, and Eleutherius were seized, bound, and dragged mercilessly through the streets. The city stirred with commotion as the three companions were hauled before the governor's tribunal, a place where justice bowed to Rome's iron will. The governor, seated in stern authority, fixed his gaze upon the young bishop. His words fell like a sentence already passed. "Bishop Denis, the emperor commands you, sacrifice to the gods, burn incense to his image. Do this, and you shall live." Denis, calm yet unyielding, answered with a voice that carried beyond the chamber. "I will offer no sacrifice but that of praise to the one true God, and to his Son, Jesus Christ." The governor's face twisted with fury. He thundered back, "Your obstinacy mocks Rome itself. The gods are the guardians of our empire, and yet you defy them." Denis, steadfast, raised his eyes heavenward and declared, "The gods you serve are no gods at all. They are but lifeless stone and fading myths. Only Christ, the Son of God, gives life eternal." At these words, the tribunal erupted into a storm of shouts, curses, and outrage. The governor, consumed with wrath, struck his verdict with cold finality. The sentence was proclaimed without delay: death by beheading. On a windswept hill just beyond the city walls, on the height that would one day be called Montmartre, the mountain of the martyrs, Denis and his faithful companions knelt, their hearts fixed on eternity. The executioner's blade caught the Parisian sunlight, a flash of steel against the sky, and with a single merciless stroke, Denis's head was severed from his body. Gasps echoed across the gathered crowd, yet heaven itself was not yet finished speaking. To the astonishment and terror of all who stood by, the bishop's body did not fall like lifeless flesh upon the ground. Instead, Denis rose to his feet, steady as though untouched, reached down with sure hands and lifted his severed head. In the annals of Christian history, this wondrous sign is known as cephalophory, from the Greek for head-bearing, a miracle granted to only a few martyrs, a testimony that even the sword cannot silence the witness of Christ. Other saints too are remembered in this manner. Saint Nicasius of Rheims, reciting the Psalms with each faltering step. Saint Osith, carrying her head to the doors of a convent. Saint Valerie, presenting hers to her confessor. Yet none bore the weight of meaning, nor the power of proclamation, as Denis. Cradling his head as though it were a sacred relic, Denis walked with unshaken resolve, each step a sermon, each moment a defiance of death itself. For several miles he journeyed, still declaring Christ, until at last he reached a hill where his strength ebbed, and there he laid himself down. Only then did he surrender his spirit into the hands of his Lord. Thus his final act thundered louder than any sermon he had ever preached, a proclamation to the ages that the word of God cannot be chained, cannot be stifled, and cannot be silenced, not even by the cold hand of death. According to tradition, after lifting his severed head, Denis carried it to a nearby fountain where he washed it clean, then rose again and walked several miles, preaching one final sermon as though death itself were compelled to listen. At last his strength waned, and he collapsed at the place he had chosen as his burial ground. The path he is said to have taken became immortalized as the Rue des Martyrs, the Street of the Martyrs, a road that still runs from Montmartre down toward the heart of Paris. Its very name became a testimony to the miracle of cephalophory, the astonishing witness of a saint who, upheld by divine power, carried his own head while proclaiming Christ. To this day, Rue des Martyrs winds through a lively district of cafes, shops and homes, yet it bears a name that refuses to let the city forget the courage of its first bishop. On the very ground where Denis fell, early believers built a humble shrine. That shrine grew and flourished into the magnificent Basilica of St. Denis, a house of worship that for centuries became both a spiritual beacon and the resting place of French kings. From this soil, soaked with the blood of its first shepherd, Paris drew its Christian identity. Denis was venerated as the patron saint of the city, his story passed down to inspire countless generations to stand unflinching in the face of trial and persecution. In the 7th century, his relics, discovered anew by the Merovingian king Dagobert I, were enshrined at the Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris, ensuring that his memory would be woven forever into the fabric of France's faith and history. The witness of Denis still speaks across the ages. Faith is not a bargaining chip with which to preserve life. It is the very essence of life itself. When kingdoms and rulers demand silence, the call of Christ is to speak all the louder. And sometimes that witness echoes beyond the grave, outliving the martyr and carrying the gospel farther than any sword could reach. If this story stirred your faith, share it with someone who needs courage today. Subscribe to Faith Reflections 247 for more true stories of unshakable faith.